Good morning to everyone. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Deputy Director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Directors Forum with the President and CEO of the Humane Society of the United States, Wayne Pacelle. Lee Hamilton, the President of the Center, unfortunately has been detained with a couple of former Secretaries of State on Capitol Hill to talk about some issues involving war powers. Established by an act of Congress in 1968, the Woodrow Wilson Center is our nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It was founded to honor and build upon his legacy as a man who bridged the divide between scholarship and public policy. We bring together the thinkers and the doers, policymakers, scholars, business leaders, in the hope and belief that a frank and open dialogue will lead to better understanding, cooperation, and better public policy. Wayne Pacelle presides over the nation's largest animal protection organization with nearly 10.5 million members and constituents, and yearly revenues, I believe, of about $130 million and assets exceeding $200 million. The Humane Society of the United States, through its parent organization, Humane Society International, works to protect animal welfare in dozens of countries and is leading efforts to internationalize the fight against animal cruelty. It is a great pleasure to have Wayne Pacelle and his colleagues' foresight that the Humane Society of the United States views this issue in national and international terms, because it is indeed a global problem. Whether it is avian flu at the international level, cruelty resulting in tainted beef at the national level, or dog fighting at the local level, this issue hits home for every single one of us in a myriad of ways. Grassroots efforts are key, but to institutionalize gains in the fight against animal cruelty, action at the state and federal level are essential. And Wayne has done just that with 20-plus federal statutes, over 400 state laws, and countless ballot initiatives to his credit. As in so many fields, the world's interconnectedness binds ethics, science, policy, and education together in ways unimaginable in generations past. It takes an impressive individual to tackle such complexities, and Wayne Pacelle is such an individual. For his work in response to Hurricane Katrina, New Prophet News named him Executive of the Year in 2005. Wayne is a graduate of Yale University. Wayne Pacelle, we welcome your comments.
Mike, thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for that welcome. This is my first visit to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I appreciate the hospitality, but also the attention to the issue of animal protection. I haven't found anything in the record about Woodrow Wilson saying much about animals, but he's certainly remembered for his idealism. And you'll find a lot of idealism in the cause of animal protection. Thank you. I will also say that we're really lucky. We actually, one of our 3 buildings in Washington, D.C. is the former campaign headquarters of Woodrow Wilson. He used it in his race in 1916, so we actually have a really interesting connection. You know, I've been around animal advocates all of my adult life, and though the issues and arguments have changed through the years, the basic convictions have endured. At its best, the cause of animal protection is one of the most altruistic ones you can find. It's a cause that arises from some of the best instincts of humanity. It reminds us that animals have claims of their own in the world. They're not just here to be used and killed. They are not just things or resources or commodities or targets or economic opportunities in the waiting. Animals have the same spark of life that we have, formed from the same dust of the earth. They want to live just as badly as we do, and often they experience life as we do. They can feel playful or angry, affectionate or afraid, sad or joyful. Some deduce rights for animals, others reject that term, but it can be an academic debate because what we're really talking about are limits and boundaries in our conduct. We need laws and standards and clear, bright lines to halt cruelty and abuse. It is for us to exercise restraint because in our dealings with the other animals, there is an asymmetry in power. We hold all of the cards. The care of animals doesn't just present a moral problem, it presents a moral opportunity. Kindness to animals makes us better people. It fosters responsibility in young men and women. It is a feature of any civil society. This is the creed, at least as we see it at the Humane Society of the United States. And like many other issues that you examine at the Wilson Center, animal welfare is now much more than a challenge of personal ethics. It is a matter of deep social concern and increasingly a matter of corporate responsibility and an essential component in good public policy. Sometimes you'll read commentaries on the subject of animal welfare, hostile or friendly, and be left with the impression that the ethical treatment of animals is a uniquely modern preoccupation. But of course, that's not the case. Human beings have given thought to the proper treatment of animals for as long as we've been capable of moral thought. People have pitied animals and empathized with animals and sought compassion and mercy for animals for as long as we have understood any of those values. When the proverb declared that, quote, the righteous man regards the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel, this was not a foreign notion in the world that we had never heard before. The admonition expressed a truth already well known, a feeling understood then and now as moral intuition and good common sense. In all of the world's great religions and philosophical traditions, you will find cruelty to animals rebuked and compassion celebrated. Among intellectuals, there are pedantic debates sometimes about whether cruelty is forbidden for the sake of the animals themselves or for the sake of a person's own virtue or spiritual state. But these disputes miss the point. What matters most is that cruelty is wrong, and it has always been recognized as such in principle and in practice. The very concept of cruelty to animals implies moral disapproval. Yet for all the cruelty in the world, you won't hear many people admit to the offense. I've seen people club and hack hundreds of seal pups in the morning and think nothing of it for the rest of the day. People who shoot elephants and can hardly contain their joy at the sight of a fallen giant. The bigger the better. And people who preside over factory farms and slaughterhouses and sleep every night undisturbed by second thoughts. The people emotionally and financially invested in these activities never see themselves as cruel. Instead, they try to explain their conduct away. They search for justifications in economics or in cultural traditions or in nature itself. They offer elaborate arguments attempting to prove that animals don't feel pain or that the animals would be worse off but for the coup de grace delivered by them. There's an old saying that, quote, man is the only rational creature. He is also the rationalizing creature. We run into that sentiment in a lot of our work at the Humane Society of the United States. And in the exploitation of animals, excuses are the one resource we'll never run out of. Of course, there's one very obvious reason that you find admonitions about cruelty to animals in every time and culture. The reason is that in every time and culture, cruelty has been a problem. Think of any merciless thing a human being can do to an animal, and at one time or another, it has been thought of and actually done. Every society has had its own signature cruelties, whether it's the violent animal fighting spectacles of the Romans, the public vivisections of 18th century England, or the mass confinement farms of industrialized nations today. Civilized societies have always known that the abuse of animals was wrong, yet civilized societies have always tolerated various forms of animal abuse. In the slow and halting progress of humanity, we too often resist change and defend what we've become accustomed to. Every age has its massive moral lapses, and this is one that we must overcome in our age. We now have an organized resistance to cruelty, and to the great credit of the United Kingdom, it really began there. Men and women of conscience came to believe that if cruelty was wrong and unworthy of humanity, then the law should not be silent. Why just rebuke cruelty in word or caution against it in lofty admonitions? Why not forbid cruelty in law as we do other serious wrongs? In time, the first major cruelty statutes were enacted, defining and enforcing standards of conduct in the treatment of animals. Skeptics at the time warned of radical implications, and in a way, they were right. There's always something a little radical when we dare to live up to our own beliefs. Among the most prominent of these early reformers were men like William Wilberforce, Cardinal Manning, and the Earl of Shaftesbury, who were champions of exploited human beings as well, and saw a connection. They believed, as Shaftesbury put it, that they were called to serve, quote, the cause of the weak, the helpless, both man and beast, and those who had none to help them. One result of their efforts was a bill introduced in the House of Lords 200 years ago, next May. It was called a Bill for Preventing Wanton and Malicious Cruelty to Animals, 200 years ago. And though it failed in 1809, these men and women were not the type to call retreat. A similar bill became the law of England in 1822. And you can draw a straight line from that reform to the early work of animal protection organizations in 19th century America and to our work today at the Humane Society of the United States and Humane Society International. This is the venerable tradition that we follow. We at the HSUS and the thousands of other animal protection groups across America and the world. Our opponents try to dismiss us, to marginalize us, and portray our concerns as trivial, foreign, doctrinaire, or worst of all, impractical. But the real power of the cause is that it speaks to the basic standards and conscience of all people of goodwill. Like all the best ideas and moral causes, we don't invent new standards and expect people to conform to them. In the spirit of Wilberforce, we remind our fellow citizens of what they already know to be true and seek to hold them to their own standards of respect and compassion for a fellow creature. We ask the same kind of questions as those early reformers about the rightful limits of human action and the responsibilities of the strong to the weak. We draw the same kind of connections between the wrongs that are forbidden in law and the wrongs that are not. We confront the same kind of contradictions. We seek the same kind of remedies to rid our country and our world of cruelties old and new. The basic problem is the same too. The fundamental tension that runs through all of our debates today about the status of animals and the obligations of humanity. And in many ways, the tension only grows as we learn more about other creatures of the earth, about their capacities, their intelligence, their emotion, their experience of suffering. On the one hand, we understand animals more than ever. Many scientists take a benevolent approach to studying animals, more so than in other times, trying to understand and explain animals on their own terms. Thanks to people like Donald Griffin and Jane Goodall, we've discovered the remarkably sophisticated language skills of parrots, the signature whistles of dolphins, the complex social structures of elephant herds, the cognitive abilities of pigs, the basic tool use of chimps, the communication among whales by sonar and song, and many other things we never knew or imagined in other times. Here and there you will find scientists who insist that the minds and feelings of animals need not concern us. But most people, all of us, we know better. We know that the appearance of thought and feeling in animals is the reality, not just some sentimental illusion. And not only do people know this to be true, more than ever, people of every age, background, and place are inspired to help and serve in the cause of animals. Every day across the world, millions are working at helping animals in need, delivering homeless animals to safety and shelter, feeding and giving comfort to animals, fighting the wildlife trade or the destruction of habitat, or making the case in legislative bodies or corporate boardrooms. Yet at the same time, even as all of this unfolds, there has never been a time in human experience when we tolerated more needless suffering inflicted upon animals. The cruelty is on a vast scale, more systematic and ruthless than ever before. In advanced societies, we've adopted some laws in an attempt to rid our communities of the rot of egregious cruelties, such as animal fighting or baiting. But we drew the curtain on the vast new systems of cruelty that were rising up in the form of laboratories, factory farms, and other places where billions of animals are condemned to lives of unyielding misery. We've become intolerant of seemingly aberrational acts of cruelty, but inattentive to normative abuse when it's cloaked or backed by a powerful economic interest. The result is a world of contradictions in which personal cruelty is forbidden and often punished, while institutional cruelty remains common, legal, and too often unhindered. We tolerate these large-scale cruelties even though at this scale they pose an increasing threat to our own well-being. No longer are the consequences of cruelty confined to its intended victims. So many troubles in the world can be traced in part to the abuse of animals. If climate change is a matter that concerns you, then the environmental cost of raising 60 billion animals for food, often on industrialized farms, also warrants your urgent attention. If the spread of disease and the danger of pandemics are a threat, then we have to get serious about stemming the exotic animal trade, the global cockfighting subculture, and mass confinement methods of producing poultry, since these industries are incubators of diseases that can jump from animals to people. If you wonder about domestic abuse or violent crime in our communities, then look no farther than how people get started. Often it starts with the abuse of animals and the loss of empathy. In the end, the case for animals stands on its merits. It needs no other concerns or connections to give it importance. Compassion for animals is now a universal value. Animals matter for their own sake and in their own right. But today, more than ever, there is a close connection between cruelty and other pressing social concerns, and that reinforces the case for animal protection in the modern era. You undoubtedly remember the case of Michael Vick. It was a good example of how the curtain is sometimes opened on truly appalling cruelties, and suddenly people get a glimpse of what's been going on all along. What started as a drug bust ended in the discovery of a multi-state dogfighting ring. Every detail of the case was discussed and debated on television. The torture of dogs, the privations and punishments they were subjected to, the viciousness of the dog and animal fighting trade. And few people but Mr. Vick and his lawyers seemed to feel that prosecutors were too harsh or the sentence too severe. When it was all over, the man had gained an NFL suspension, lost a Nike sponsorship, a $100 million contract, and he had earned the prison sentence he's now serving. As the debate broadened beyond Vick's acts into the larger subculture of dogfighting, Americans learned that dogfighting is almost always entangled with other criminal behavior, such as narcotics and human violence. People began to understand that the dogs are the victims, but so are the other members of the community. Dogfighting is a gateway crime, and society has a variety of compelling reasons to root it out. A more recent story you certainly remember concerned a Southern California slaughter plant called Hallmark Meat Company, and it struck a different chord with the American public. The Vick case struck at our notions of responsible treatment of companion animals, dogs and cats and other animals that we lavish with attention and spend $40 billion plus on a year. The Hallmark case was also a matter of conscience, but it put the uncomfortable subject of rearing animals for food on the front page and, more importantly, on the television screen. When the dairy industry is done with milk cows, the cows are sent to slaughter, but often they're too sick or lame to even walk to their death. It's common enough that the industry has a term for them, downer cows. And you probably recall what our undercover investigator recorded. The downer cows were being tormented with electricity to get them to stand. They were rammed with forklifts. They even had high-pressure water hoses put into their nostrils and mouth to simulate a drowning effect to get these hapless animals up and closer to the slaughter area. One camera caught these scenes in one slaughterhouse. And for a few days at least, the American public saw through the happy cow ad campaigns of the dairy industry. In short order, schools across the nation stopped serving beef because their second largest supplier was exposed as a merciless abuser of sick and crippled animals. Mad cow disease, E. coli, and salmonella, along with animal cruelty and the slaughter of crippled animals, became part of the more complete narrative of the meat industry. During the process, the public questioned gaps in the regulatory system. Prosecutors brought the first felony charges ever against slaughterhouse workers. Members of Congress probed the issue thus far in 8 separate hearings. The USDA ordered the largest beef recall in American history, and a $100 million company was closed, probably forever. All of this was to the good. Justice was served in the case at hand. And it would be unfair and a little ungrateful to use the Hallmark case as an example of selective judgments in public opinion. The truth is, it showed the power of public opinion at its best. It showed how much people can influence events when they follow their instincts and demand that corporations and government do better. We need more of that spirit, a lot more of it, because the scenes from that one slaughter plant are just the smallest glimpse of the nightmarish world of industrial farming. Factory farming has become an amoral business, detached from any standards of decent and honorable animal husbandry. And though the pitiful circumstances demand the enactment and enforcement of laws, we don't need a statute to make our own choices right now. Every one of us can take our business elsewhere and use the market to get animals out of their cages and crates and mass confinement circumstances. This is the tension that runs through our debates on industrial agriculture and so many other animal welfare issues. And often the best way to break the tension is to point out the obvious. Factory farming is a rotten and morally corrupt business, and the whole world would be better off without it. It's not only wrong on its face, it's a massively inefficient way to produce protein, and it pollutes our soil, air, and water. We hear a lot of environmentalists these days warning us about the dangers of global warming. The more prominent ones pride themselves as bold truth tellers. But if you want to know which ones warrant the most attention, it's those who refuse to overlook one of the biggest problems of all. More than cars and trucks, industrial energy use, or anything else, the bigger source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world is livestock agriculture. We run into a lot of conflict and controversy at HSUS, but what always strikes me the most in these debates is the static nature of the arguments that our opponents make. They cling to old ways and old traditions as if nothing is ever allowed to change, no matter the costs or the harm. The sealers in Atlantic Canada talk as if life could not go on without forever clubbing and killing newborn baby seals. And as soon as one reason for the slaughter is disproved, they quickly pick up another. They don't care that the world is moving on. They just want to keep things exactly as they are. It's the same with the whalers in Japan and Norway. They know that whale watching is a potentially more lucrative and sustainable source of revenue, but they don't want to hear it, and they don't want to change. They just want to go on killing, and without international action, they would stay at it and haul in and carve up thousands of whales, including many of the rarest. The same is true for so many of the other interests and industries we deal with at the HSUS. The fur farmers and the trappers, the horse slaughter plants and the killer buyers, the trophy hunters, the animal testing lobby, the cockfighters, and on and on and on. They all want to live in a static world, doing the same thing in the same way forever. In an odd way, however, this is good news for the cause of animal protection, because it means that human innovation is our ally. We don't just have human conscience working for us, though that will always take the lead. We have all the resourcefulness of the human mind, the boundless capacity of this nation and others to change, to question, to improve, to shake off old ways. The cause of animal protection not only speaks to the conscience of America, it speaks as well to the ingenuity of America. And that is always a force you want on your side. Every so often you come across one story that captures the big picture in animal welfare. And I found one the other day about a whale who was hunted and killed by native hunters last year off the Alaska coast. These self-described subsistence hunters hauled in a bowhead whale only to find that they were not the first to hunt that particular creature. Embedded in the flesh of the whale were the fragments of a bomb lance, traceable to a type of shoulder gun last used before 1890. Only in recent years have we learned how long whales live. And this creature killed in the year 2007 was at least 130 years old. The lance carried a small metal cylinder fitted with a time delay fuse, but it had failed to kill the whale, and he survived the span of the entire 20th century without further harm. When Edison was working on the phonograph, this whale was feeding on plankton and diving in Arctic waters. Before Wilson was president of Princeton, much less president of the United States, this whale was learning his migration routes. He lived all that time only to be slaughtered by men with harpoons, dodging the orcas that are the only predators he would ever have to face. But the hopeful side of the story is how much the world can change. In 100 years, even in the life of a single whale. It was a century that began with the old economy of hunting and killing whales, and ended with a new economy of appreciating whales and watching whales. It was a century that began with the lonely few animal welfare groups, a scarcity of laws to constrain human greed, and a worldview that animals were there for the taking. But by the end of that century, there were hundreds of new groups, thousands of new laws to shield animals from cruelty and abuse, and an emerging attitude that we are custodians of the other creatures, called to defend them and be their voice. A lot can happen in 100 years or in much less time, and the life and fate of this single creature teaches us that change for the better is not only possible, it is certain in our lifetime and in the generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pacelle has agreed to answer some questions, and the floor is open.
Could you address the international dimension of your mission and collaboration with humane societies in other countries and the status of national laws and international conventions to address the issues you outlined?
Sure. What we find is that almost all the issues we deal with are not confined to the United States, whether it's cockfighting, where there's a global trade in birds for fighting, or for that matter, dogs for fighting. Dogs are sold to Eastern Europe from the U.S. or to Russia. There's a commerce back to the U.S. Obviously, agriculture is a global industry. The wildlife trade is said to be the second largest trade in the world after the drug trade in terms of illegal commerce. It's said to be a $10 billion industry. So we work on all of the major international conventions dealing with animals. One of the big ones is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's called CITES. And we work to stem the trade in animals and their parts. We work with the International Whaling Commission, and we work increasingly with the Food and Agriculture Organization. We're doing humane slaughter work in Southeast Asia, in Central America. We're working with industry organizations, cattlemen's groups, and others about more humane farming practices. So our website, humanesociety.org, we have a whole international division, and I couldn't do it justice. We work on almost all the issues and increasingly work with our allies in Europe. We have an office in Brussels working in the European Union. We have a Costa Rica office. I think one of the great challenges is what we're going to do in China, which is an enormous consumer of animals, wildlife products at a scale that almost defies our imagination. They're developing industrialized agriculture, and in a nation of 1.3 billion people, if they adopt our same practices here as they're on the route to, it will be devastating for animals and for the environment.
Thank you very much for a very riveting lecture. Question, as a follow-up to my colleague's question, what, if anything, is being done about dealing with issues of animals in armed conflict? Just by my background, I spent a lot of time on the international prosecutorial level, and some of the worst, however, less paid attention to aspects of cruelty come out of armed conflict. The starvation of the Sarajevo zoo animals by sniping at the zookeepers. Things like that. Now, those are just tiny examples.
Yeah.
But is there some effort, because there is an interest, but there doesn't seem to be any group around which, at least from my experience, there is any action. Does the Red Cross factor this in? Is there anything that you see as a way of bringing it to the forefront, realizing that the primary concern is reducing the suffering of human beings? Nonetheless, it is a horrific problem.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. War and armed conflict between people and nations obviously has a destabilizing effect in any area where that occurs, and that often means that the support systems that exist for animals previously, if they existed at all, often fade away. And that means that animals starve in zoos, and it means that animals are left on the street without any attention. It means that animals are abandoned when people flee. I mean, even here in the United States, we heard about this foreclosure crisis and people leaving their homes and then leaving the animals in the home. So you can imagine in a war zone what occurs. And obviously, animals become victims. I mean, there are just countless ways. The difficulty for a group like ours is that going into a conflict situation like that, what can you do? It's so vast and overpowering. And we're trying to build capacity in countries to have them be able to deal with their animal issues. There's a group in the UK called the Brook Fund for Animals, and they work with working animals all over the world, with mules and donkeys and other creatures who are enlisted for labor. So the set of issues is vast, and I think, in some ways it can become overwhelming, but what I try to remind our supporters all the time is that we may never solve, and I'm sure that we will never solve, the issue of human-caused cruelty and neglect. But every investment we make that saves any animal, or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 10 million, is an investment that we made wisely. And the scope of the problem is enormous because of this worldview. So many people think of animals as just things or objects. And we have this, I tried to draw it out in my comments, this terrible contradiction in our society, certainly in Western nations, of love for animals and fascination and appreciation for them, yet we also have these institutionalized cruelties that go on a daily basis. And, we need to sync up our love and appreciation for animals with what's going on in the world.
Taking that second question to another level, more local level, what many of us see when we travel overseas, Wayne, to developing countries are packs of street dogs. What's your message to governments that are having a hard time feeding their people and whatnot, but you just can't go to an urban center, indeed into villages around the world without seeing packs of street dogs? How do you deal with that, and what's your message where you know there are a lot of related problems that are making it difficult to get to that issue? Mm-hmm.
As I said, I again, as I tried to draw out in my prepared remarks, I really do believe that kindness is a foundation stone for any civil society. And I think that we cannot ignore the least among us, because if we do, it desensitizes us to suffering. So I think that there's a case to be made to be concerned about animals wherever it exists as part of the process of building a civil society. But again, the case for animals does not rest just on their own moral consideration. I mean, the issue of street dogs and packs of dogs in the developing world, certainly in China and India, rabies is a major public health issue. Tens of thousands of people are afflicted every year in China and India. So these are public health issues. Factory farming, where really the bird flu has been around. I'll just take a moment to deviate from the dog. Bird flu has been around for a long time, but not in the form that we have seen it develop in Southeast Asia, because in factory farms you can have a far greater number of mutations of the strain of bird flu. And it can become more and more virulent, progressively more virulent, because there's so many more opportunities for mutation. Because when you crowd millions of animals onto a factory farm, they're close to each other. The spread of disease is there, and it's there that the more virulent forms of bird flu are moving. And this is a derivative, in our view, of factory farming. And when we're tampering with the historical relationships between animals, when they used to be kind of out in the pasture, they were not at densities that created this incubator for disease. The same with the wild animal trade. It was monkeypox. If some of you may remember, there was a case of monkeypox here in the United States a couple of years ago. That came from an animal who was captured in Africa, brought to the United States to be sold for the pet trade. I mean, we live in a global economy, and disease and so many other problems are related to animals. 60% of diseases that afflict human beings started with animals, and they jumped the species barrier. The common cold started in horses. Tuberculosis started in certain animals and then jumped to humans. AIDS is thought to have originated in primates. In Africa, and people started to kill and eat primates for the bushmeat trade, and we now have a global pandemic with 25 million people dead as a consequence of AIDS. So I think that these health issues should be priorities for governments, and I think that from a rabies control issue to a dog bite issue, these are threats to children.
That's very interesting. Yes, further questions. The lady in the green dress. Yeah. Turquoise, sorry.
Yeah. I say you're like my father, colorblind.
Hurricane Katrina resulted in the largest animal rescue effort in history, and there were a lot of silver linings that came out of that. I was wondering what you think are the long-term implications for animal welfare.
Thanks for the question. And like the question about war and the effect on the animals, when Katrina happened, there was no safety net for animals in a disaster setting. The entire responsibility for the care of the animals rested upon the nonprofit community, groups like HSUS, which at the time had a small disaster services department. We've now grown it pretty dramatically. But it was interesting. I was down in Louisiana for a number of weeks, and I saw time and again the Coast Guard or the Navy or the firefighters, the first responders who went to rescue people who were in peril. They ran into lots of people with pets because 2/3 of American households have pets. There are 165 million dogs and cats in people's homes. And the government had no policy on taking the animals. So they found people, stranded in a home with water, up to the window level, and the people couldn't get out. The Coast Guard, offered a helping hand, that we will take you away. We're here to safeguard you. And they said, well, yeah, but I've got my German Shepherd. We can take him along too. And they said, no, we have no policy. We can't do that. And so many people said, well, thanks for the offer, but I'm not going to abandon my best friend during his greatest time of crisis. And it pointed out, and I think that lawmakers in the states and the federal government saw, that you really cannot have an effective human disaster response without accounting for the emotional bond that people have with their animals. If you don't care for that bond and you don't recognize it, then you're going to undermine the effectiveness of the response. So we worked, just as in the Michael Vick case, we pivoted now. 26 states are considering legislation to upgrade their statutes against dogfighting and cockfighting. 17 states passed new laws dealing with pets and disasters after Katrina, and the Congress passed a really great comprehensive law dealing with the issue. And we will never have anything like Katrina where we're just relying on a small number of groups, nonprofit groups, to solve the issue. Now the government will play a role in planning and preparation. We're working with counties and states all across the country on disaster plans for animals and people, because like my comments in general, you just cannot separate the two. It's not an either-or circumstance. It's all intertwined. The global economy entangles us with animals for good and for bad, and we have to deal with the issues.
Yes, Lindsay.
Wayne, could you address, you talked about compassion for animals and animals being sentient beings. Can you address that relating to a vegan diet, why that's so important? The factory farms, what happens to egg-laying hens and to de-toed hens and to everything that happens in factory farms? How, so we don't listen to you for an hour and go off and buy a steak in the cafeteria. What can you tell us regarding that?
Well, agriculture has changed. Even from 30 or 40 years ago, there's been a dramatic change. There's been kind of a mass movement of animals, certain animals particularly, poultry, chickens and turkeys raised for meat, egg-laying hens who produce eggs, and pigs raised for pork. They've been moved into these large industrial confinement facilities where the animals are in cages and crates, often just barely larger than the animal's body, so the animals often can't turn around, extend their limbs, open their wings, flap their wings. Their most basic behaviors, which they still have, even though they've been domesticated for a long time, they still have instincts to the animals. I mean, egg-laying hens want to dust bathe, they want to peck at the ground, they want to perch, they want to engage in a variety of behaviors. All those basic behaviors are frustrated on factory farms. And again, tying into the connectivity of these issues, we know that when you cluster so many animals together, you create manure management problems. And hog farms have just produced enormous volumes of waste that's not treated. I mean, human waste with 300 million people in this country is treated. And it's still a big problem. There was a recent article in the New Yorker I read about it. But we have 10 billion animals raised for food in this country. We have 105 million pigs. They're much larger than humans. They produce more waste. So where is all this waste going? It's effluent that's going into the groundwater. It's going into open-air lagoons. It's putrefying the air. It's driving down property values in rural communities across the nation. It's poisoning fish and diminishing the quality of the riparian areas. And then the biggest issue of all, which again I did mention in my remarks, I didn't cite the report, but the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations produced a report last year saying that 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon dioxide, but methane and nitrous oxide, are produced by livestock agriculture. 60 billion animals in the world raised for food. We cannot continue this level of animal production and do so in a sustainable and humane way. Unless there's some incredible innovation that occurs, I just don't see it. So, obviously we think that being vegetarian or vegan is an outstanding option. You've got great foods of the world that you can draw upon and live a more healthful lifestyle for yourself, for the environment. It's obviously the best for the animals because they're not killed for human consumption. But if people don't want to go that far, just reducing by 10% or 20% or 30%, imagine if Americans, where we raise 10 billion animals a year for food, if we just reduce our consumption by 10%, we would save 1 billion animals. 1 billion. I mean, the numbers are staggering. So, I think that a lot of people, it's a difficult subject to confront diet because it's so personal. I remember when I told my mother I was going vegetarian and vegan, she was shocked. She thought it was a phase. It's 23 years later. It's not a phase. But I think wherever you are, we're all traveling a path, but I think any serious person must think about our relationship with animals and what our obligations to animals are. And it can't be just to dogs and cats, as worthy and valuable as that is, and we encourage anyone to do anything for animals. If they just want to focus on spay, neuter, or responsible pet care, we think that's great. But the biggest issue for animals in this country, because of the numbers, is animal agriculture. And it's taken a harsh turn. And I think we should all think about it.
I have two questions here and then in the back row.
Not to focus on factory farming, but it's interesting that this Pew report came out recently that addresses the issue too. Two things I take away from what you're talking about are you contrast that humane ethics not only make moral sense, but they can make good economic sense both in the short term and the long term. And I also see you contrast the old economy versus the new economy. And in the wake of the Hallmark Westland investigation and the congressional hearings that have come about, we've had a chance to hear from some traditional people who engage in traditional family farming methods. And is it possible that when we're talking about animal agriculture, that the old economy, the new economy, is really the old economy, or maybe the old McDonald economy?
Well, it's a good question. It's a good observation. I'm just, we've lost a lot of farmers, and it's not because of work done by the Humane Society of the United States. It's consolidation within these industries. I mean, you have smaller numbers of people controlling larger numbers of animals. I mean, a huge number of pigs and chickens and turkeys are controlled by a few corporations. And this consolidation has driven out small farmers who were part of the fabric of this country and part of rural economies in this country. And I think it was 30 years ago there were 700,000 hog farmers in the U.S. Now there are 70,000. So the numbers are staggering. They're absolutely staggering. I'm not sure we can return ourselves. I don't think we can to the 1920s or 30s, 40s or 50s or 60s, but there certainly is a movement toward more extensive systems and toward more humane agriculture methods. The question, though, is not, can we match that production that we have now? The question is, can we possibly sustain this level of rearing of animals? I just don't think that we can. 70% of the earth is covered by water. Of the terrestrial landscape, much of it's covered by rock and ice. The habitable portion of the world is not particularly large. We have 6.4 billion people on the planet. And if we are inefficiently consuming protein through animals, we are complicating our feeding strategy very significantly.
There are two more questions, the back row and then Shabita.
I was wondering what you do when you come into a culture where they do mistreat animals. Like we lived in the island of Guam, and they used their dogs, they tied them up and they used them for protection. They didn't feed them well. And we had a little Labrador, and of course our children were kissing him and laying with him and playing with him. And he went lopping over to try to play with one of these dogs, and they almost ripped out his eye. And I know that our neighbors were saying, well, we never saw anyone treat a dog like you do. Why do you treat your dog like that? And I was wondering, since Guam is a territory of the United States, what do you do when you try to change someone's tradition or culture?
Well, there's no formula for it for sure. I mean, I mentioned that the stirrings of humane sensibilities began 200 years ago, really, in the UK, and then the first animal group in the United States was the American SPCA in 1866. Just a year after the Civil War ended, we started to turn our attention to this issue of the question of animals. So really it takes kind of moral pioneers. It takes people in those communities, in those territories or countries who start to show a different way, a different pathway. And I think, one of the great opportunities we do have with the global economy is the world is so small. I mean, people do have access to information, and they can get information about a better way to do things, and they can learn and read. That's why, obviously, education is a foundation stone as well for any civil society. People need to be educated to be able to think critically and to look into these matters. But, Guam is a big cockfighting territory, huge. And also Puerto Rico, cockfighting's banned now. We just banned it in New Mexico and Louisiana by acts of state legislature last year, but it was legal. 40 or 50 cockfighting arenas in Louisiana, some with 1,000 seats for spectators. Incredible. And Puerto Rico has 110 cockfighting arenas. So these problems are very, very, very difficult, and really what we need to do is enable people in those countries who can articulate the case for animals and open people's eyes to the fact, again, like I said, that these animals have the same spark of life that we have. They want to live just as much as we do.
Two quick questions. Shobita, and then on the side here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk generally about the Humane Society's position and also activities on the use of animals in scientific research, and also specifically related to that, the production and use of genetically engineered animals and use in biotechnology.
I hope that we're an organization that does not cower from tough moral positions. So I think I stated a pretty strong set of views here, but we're also very practical, and we understand the cultural context, the sociological context in which the use of animals occurs. So we have kind of an impatience for change, yet a tolerance for the circumstances that allowed these conditions to develop and these patterns of abuse to develop. So with the use of animals in testing and research, those are two kind of different questions, but we're really driven by a principle developed by a couple of scientists, and now it's widely accepted in scientific circles. It's called the 3 R's, and it's a strategy for dealing with the issue. One is is refinement. That's one of the R's. So you refine techniques to minimize pain and distress, recognizing that animals are going to be used, at least for the short run. Let's minimize the pain and distress. Second is reduce. So if you have 20 animals called for in the original protocol, if you can reduce to 10 and not compromise the integrity of the experiment, then you're helping those 10 animals and sparing them. And third, and I think most importantly, is replace. Let's find new pathways to learn. You know, this is, if you put billions of dollars into a slot machine, you're going to occasionally get some good information that comes out of it, or good, you'll get some winnings every once in a while, but doesn't mean it's necessarily the most efficient way or the best way. We've got to find a different way to learn and to address the public health issues in this country. So the 3 R's, that's also our approach on animal agriculture. Refine techniques to stop this caging and crating of animals. Reduce the animals, so if an average person eats 40 animals a year, which is about the standard, if you can reduce to 30 or 20, then you're helping a lot of animals. And replace, there are great, wonderful foods in the world that you can draw from to live a healthful lifestyle.
Over here.
Yes. As a very moderate consumer of meat, in Europe normally I look for whatever product is labeled as free range or this kind of things, because I know that there is a legislation behind this. Here in the States, I don't really know the value of this label, so I would really like to understand what I should choose.
Yes. Well, it's a very good question, and unfortunately there's not a lot of guidance in the signage on packaging. Right now there's an actual definition of organic, which includes outdoor access for animals, but it doesn't stipulate anything beyond that in terms of the welfare of the animals. They just have to have some access to the outdoors. We are now working with Whole Foods Market, which is a pretty big retailer, not one of the biggest by any means, but certainly $5 or $6 billion company, and we're developing with them a star system. That 1 star is still in development, but 1 star would be, basic animal welfare standards, like animals are not in gestation crates or battery cages. 2 stars would be higher welfare, 3, 4, and 5. So we're hoping to give consumers the guidance in the marketplace to allow them to make a more informed choice. Right now, you have some options, organic is one, but terms like natural don't have any legal definition and are appropriated oftentimes by industrial agribusiness firms. So I would not have any confidence in that. Local production of food is obviously very good. Farmers markets and the like are very good. And now that we're into spring and about to hit summer, farmers markets are an increasing pathway. There's some great books on the subject. The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan is very good, and there's a new book he has that I read. I can't remember the name, but his little credo on it, I thought it was a brilliant book. The first words of the book are eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
The last question, I promise. You've been very, very good and attentive audience.
Given the current food price crisis, I was wondering what you thought the effect would be on factory farming. It's mainly rice and wheat, of course.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. It's like with the oil issues and, gas prices, so many of the companies take advantage of these situations, it seems to me, and they jack up prices even farther than what the market is telling. But these are, commodities in a sense. And I think ethanol has driven up prices for corn and basic grains that are fed to animals. So you'll see higher meat prices because, now higher prices for corn because now so much corn is being channeled into fuel production, which I think is not a sound strategy. And the real costs of meat are not reflected in the marketplace. The externalities in terms of animal abuse, environmental degradation, contribution of greenhouse gas emissions to climate change, these are the true costs of these products, and they're not reflected in the marketplace now.
I want to thank you all for being here. We certainly have discussed an important public policy